You're listening to Love and Libido with me, your host, Dr. Emily Jamea. The goal of this podcast is to educate and inspire. My hope is that you will learn tools to create connection and cultivate passion, both within yourself and in your relationships. Here's what's coming up on today's episode. So let's talk about pleasure.
Yes.
So you've talked about the importance of assuming a holistic approach when it comes to helping people who struggle from different types of sexual problems. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yes. So by a holistic approach, I'm not saying that I think you need to take vitamins and minerals and drink water and do deep breathing, although those things certainly can't hurt and are very good for your health overall. But really what I'm talking about is, we have, when we think of pleasure, right, we have to kind of address it from many different perspectives. And so, of course, from a very basic perspective, it's about not feeling ashamed to own your sexual pleasure and to find out what feels good to your body and to prioritize it. And whether that involves using different types of sex toys or role playing or figuring out what it is that works for your body, those things are definitely important. But more than that, I just feel like our ability to enjoy sex really comes from a psychological place. Mm-hmm. And I think that too often kind of gets ignored or not really appreciated. So for example, I think that, as we discussed, there is a lot of anxiety and shame, right? We're taught to feel embarrassed about just about every aspect of sex, from a very young age. But beyond that, right, we're also, taught to be really hard on our bodies, right? So for example, I think body image, right, and trying to address underlying body image issues can really be sometimes at the heart of not being able to enjoy sex, right? Mm-hmm. Masters and Johnson, in their original sexual response model, they, talked about this phenomenon that can happen during sex called spectatoring. And when you're engaging in spectatoring, you're literally coming outside of your brain, outside of your mind, outside of the experience, and you're looking at yourself from the outside, right? You're almost judging yourself as a harsh critic. Mm-hmm. And what that does is it keeps you from being in the moment. It keeps you from being able to enjoy sex. It keeps you from being able to feel the pleasure and experience the pleasure and really focus on that. It keeps you from being able to look at your partner's sexual cues and to follow them. Mm-hmm. So body image, I think, is huge. I think addressing underlying anxiety and stress is huge, right? If we're stressed out and exhausted, I think things like sleep and nutrition and exercise and just physically feeling like you're in a place to enjoy sex is really important. Mm-hmm. If there are underlying relationship issues, right, those need to be addressed. Now, the thing that's sort of, interesting about sex and relationships is that they're cyclical. So, that it's, it takes intimacy within relationships oftentimes to lead to really intimate pleasurable sex, but we also know that pleasurable, intimate sex also helps people to enjoy their relationships, right? There's research that shows that the more sex you have, the better able you are to cope with all of our partner's minor annoyances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even some of the major ones.
And some of the major
depending
ones.
on how good the sex is.
Exactly. And then even almost from like a more existential standpoint, I think that it's important that we emphasize just having meaning in our lives, right? Yep. I mean, feeling a sense of social connectedness, feeling like you have goals that are important to you, whatever they may be. Because at the end of the day, the only way we're really going to experience pleasure is if we can come into the experience from a place of autonomy and freedom and self-confidence and feeling like you're not in any way trapped by your shame or by doubts. And so again, it's kind of like just having the ability to prioritize yourself and say, what is going to help me to get into that psychological place, to get into that physical place where I'm able to connect with a partner, whether it's a casual sex encounter or a 30-year relationship, so that I feel my best and I'm coming to that place from a sense of peace and happiness. So
Totally. I think that, what I'm hearing you say is there is probably a bit of an overemphasis on what makes sex physically pleasurable.
yes.
But what is so interesting and something I see all the time as a sex and relationship therapist is there are people for whom the sex may be physically pleasurable. Maybe they're able to have orgasms without any issue or, arousal functions just fine, but they feel kind of empty afterwards. And I think that is where meaning comes in and happiness, because there's a little bit of a difference between kind of hedonistic pleasure
Yes.
and happiness and meaning. And that's where I think how you feel about yourself and how you feel about your relationship and whatever is going on emotionally within yourself and between you and your partner or anything else that might be going on in your life, whatever's going on contextually can totally alter the way that you feel about a sexual experience.
Yes, absolutely. And there's robust research showing that if you look at predictors of sexual satisfaction, that feelings of connectedness and intimacy are important. It is, as you said, not just about orgasms. And, that research has been found to be especially true for women who oftentimes, I even did, I wrote this article for Psychology Today a few months ago about the importance of kissing. Because
Yes.
kissing is something that I think is vastly underrated, but yet can bring a lot of pleasure, right? And it's extremely intimate, right? That is a form. I mean, a lot of people have sex without kissing, and that is disconnected sex. It doesn't mean that it can't be pleasurable to some people in some scenarios, but
Right.
for the most part, it's not. And so the study I was talking about looks at how sexual satisfaction, especially for women, and even orgasm frequency is predicted by how much the couple is kissing during sex. So, I think there's something, that's kind of a direct sign of intimacy, and it really
Yeah.
shows how it's an important element.
Totally.
Yeah.
Kissing and just physical touch. There has been,
Yes.
studies that have looked at the role physical touch plays in sexual desire and sexual satisfaction. And they have found that people who cuddle more, who touch each other more, tend to have higher levels of sexual satisfaction. It can make a huge difference for people with low libido just to have that physical contact with their partner. And so I get people all the time who will come in saying, well, I'm just not a very touchy-feely person. And I'm like, do it anyway.
Do it anyway.
Do it anyway, as long as it's like not
Yes,
uncomfortable for you for some reason. But
exactly.
that's what the science shows is that even for people
Exactly.
who don't value it, they tend to get a
Yes.
lot of positive benefit from it.
Yes. And, it is a fundamental fact in psychology that sometimes our behavior has to precede our cognitions, which means that sometimes you've got to fake it till you make it, right? And it's just,
Yep.
you need to cuddle, you need to touch. Over time that will become more comfortable, and that will lead to more desire for sex and intimacy for sure.
Definitely. Let me break that down for people. So, as when we're thinking psychologically, we're always looking at our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And so what Nicole is saying is that sometimes how we feel and what we think may not quite align with how we're engaging behaviorally in that moment, but that by making some of those behavioral shifts, eventually the thoughts and feelings catch up, and then you can feel differently about yourself.
Exactly. Thank you for translating that.
Yeah. So, Nicole, what would you say are some of the biggest myths out there that keep people from enjoying sex?
Well, I think one of the biggest myths, and a lot of this just comes from the way our, culture and as we are as individuals are just bombarded by images and ideas that are being promoted with filters and that just portray totally unrealistic ideas about what bodies and sex look like. And I think, overall, I think that, and I'm basis on research showing that pornography can absolutely, overall, I am not anti-porn, and it can definitely help spark desire and help, couples come up with creative ways to, and, get fantasy going. But the problem is that because we don't have good sex education, a lot of people, especially younger people now, are looking at online porn and thinking that it's actually a realistic portrayal of bodies and sex, when in fact, it really is just meant to be fantasy.
If you liked this video, drop me a like and subscribe below. Share with a friend who might find it interesting. You can also listen to this in podcast form anywhere podcasts are streamed by searching for Love and Libido with Dr. Emily Jamea. Finally, follow me across all social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamea for daily emotional and physical intimacy tips.